All right, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to those joining us from around the world. I'm Keith Fox, CEO of Phaidon, and the best part of my job is working with the world's most influential artists, chefs, writers, and thinkers to create beautiful and essential books. I'm delighted to welcome you to the inaugural Phaidon Preview, our early access series featuring authors in conversation with their editors. You're here today because you're Phaidon's most valued customers, retailers, partners, authors, and friends. Stay tuned for upcoming conversations with legendary Sir Paul Smith, the world-renowned chef Magnus Nilsson, and the one and only Diane von Furstenberg, each of whom is now part of the extended Phaidon family. We're kicking off today's series with the inimitable Simon Doonan, writer, entertainer, former Barney's creative director, and now the star of NBC's Making It, and a man I have known for over 30 years. Simon will be joined in conversation by Phaidon's Vice President and Group Publisher Deb Aronson for an exclusive preview of his new book, How to Be Yourself, Life-Changing Advice from a Reckless Contrarian, a truly hilarious and much anticipated new addition to Phaidon's best-selling self-help franchise. The book will be released globally on September 30th. So here's how the event's going to run. Deb and Simon will speak for about 20 minutes, and then Simon will respond to your questions. To submit a question, use the chat function on your screen. Thank you for being part of Phaidon Preview. Thank you for being part of the extended Phaidon family. And now please enjoy some life-changing advice.
Thanks so much, Keith. Hi, Simon.
Hi.
Oh, how are you?
I'm good. As you can see, I made an effort with my outfit to match the book.
It's perfect, color coordinated. Yeah. We would expect no less. Sorry, there's a little bit of noise outside my apartment. So let's start off talking about the book's title and subtitle. How to Be Yourself, Life-Changing Advice from a Reckless Contrarian. Can you explain what a reckless contrarian is?
Well, probably the best way to explain it is to give a few examples. And I think I've always been a reckless contrarian, as exemplified by the fact that when I was about 6 or 7, I can remember it, my mom took me to the circus, and my mom was always very dressed up. You know, she's a working class lady who you put a lot of emphasis on her appearance. So it wasn't like she was dowdy or anything. But we're watching the elephants come out, and there's a lady in yellow chiffon and feathers with sequins on the top of the elephant. And I nudged my mother like this aggressively, and I said, "Why can't you dress like that?" You know, and I think I've always been that person who was very willing, possibly too willing, to dole out reckless advice that could potentially have huge impacts on other people. I remember I worked with, when I was in window display in London, I worked with a girl who's always moaning about her boyfriend. You know, he was this, he was that. And I said, okay, tomorrow you leave him and go and live in Saint-Tropez. It's all about Saint-Tropez. Everything's happening in Saint-Tropez. So I remember my dad saying to me, you're very free with this sort of completely reckless advice. So I think I've always been that person. In fact, Deb, correct me if I'm wrong, but you and I had extensive conversations with my editor as well, Sarah Bader, about this issue, because you said to me, essentially, this book can't be a bunch of crazy, unfurling suggestions that are going to catapult people into ghastly situations. There actually has to be some useful, grounded, meaningful advice, correct?
That's absolutely right. And actually, I think we hit the perfect balance in the book of getting some of that reckless contrarianism in there, but actually finding advice that really applies to people and people's lives. And that's actually like really solid advice. So I'm glad you brought up your mom, of course, Betty, who you talk about a lot in the book, but you also talk about your family and you really describe them as unusual. So what did growing up in the kind of environment that you grew up in sort of teach you?
Well, it was a mixed bag. We sort of lived in a rooming house, and there were uncles and aunts and a lot of mental illness and a lot of unhinged personalities. But my parents themselves were unconventional in the best possible way. You know, my mama left school at 13. My dad had joined the RAF when he was 15. They were completely self-created, unconventional people who didn't care what the neighbors thought, just as well, because we were like the Addams family in the street. So they didn't have that self-critical, self-conscious thing. They really weren't concerned with, you know, growing up in the 50s and 60s in England, people were very conscious of the neighbors, keeping up with the Joneses, all that stuff. And my parents, for a variety of reasons, didn't get that gene. So I'm forever grateful for that. That's where I get my obliviousness to the opinions of others. And yeah. So I was very lucky, really. And then the rest of it was kind of sad, a mixture of very sad, very poignant, people who had very difficult lives. My grandmother, who lived with us, had a lobotomy, you know. So I got to see people who had really had dark, difficult lives. But my parents were the sort of managed to always rise above things and under difficult circumstances.
Yeah. So I think it's really interesting because you talk about your family, and then you talk also about your current relationship with your husband, Jonathan Adler, the designer. You sort of talk about I love the part in your book where you talk about how you first meet and how it's a little bit of a disaster. And you talk about why you think your relationship has lasted as long as it has, which is it longer than how long you've known Keith, or almost exactly the same time?
Very parallel, actually.
Yeah. So one of the things that's great about the way that you talk about your relationship, and being a dog owner, it strikes a special spot. You hold up canine behavior and how we behave with our dogs as like the model for perfect human relationships. Can you talk about that a little bit, and also tell us about Foxy Lady, of course?
Well, Foxy Lady, our current dog, is a little rescue lady, a rescue mutt from the North Shore Animal League. And when I get home, she rushes towards me with a look of adoration on her face. You know, she's never in a bad mood. She never says things like, you know, I worried, I just ate a dog biscuit and it wasn't GMO, non-GMO, or, you know, organic. She doesn't fret. She just flings herself into every situation with enthusiasm and abandon. And I think that's, you know, it's so easy to come home and be in a grumpy mood and da-da-da-da-da. Dogs somehow make the effort not to do that. And I think it's truly charming. And so their willingness to give you unbridled affection, roll on their back, look at you adoringly and panting. And, you know, if you do that with your boyfriend, they're going to love it. You know, you're like physically engaged the way one is with one's dog, grabbing the ears and, oh, you're gorgeous. You know, who likes that, right?
It's true. And in the book, you also talk a lot about how we should be interacting with people in real life, you know, people who we, you know, run into or talk to at work, people who we meet at parties, public transportation. I think a lot about that now in terms of sort of where the world is and being stuck at home with the pandemic. And I think about that my social skills are probably atrophying like an unused muscle. what would you say is, what advice would you give, or what would you say to kind of like, how can we keep that muscle in shape, or keep working that muscle so that we don't lose all of our social skills entirely?
I think you're really horribly onto something. And I think I see my own social skills have atrophied quite a bit. You know, I've sort of recently re-entered a working situation at the moment, and I feel like I'm going to have a mental breakdown. And I think it might be neurological as well as behavioral. So it might take a little while to come back, you know, back to Foxy Lady. When we got her, she would jump onto the couch and miss, and she'd hit the edge of the couch. And I said to the vet, I think there's something wrong with her vision. She can't see the couch to jump on it. And he said, no, it's neurological. She's been in a shelter, in a cage for possibly a year or so. So it's going to take her a year and a half to generate the neural networks necessary for gauging depth perception. So I think, yeah, we're all probably lost some of our social finesse, and it's going to take a while to come back. And just be patient with it, and remember Foxy Lady, because now she's great. She can get right on the couch.
I think that brings up another really interesting thing, which you also talk about in the book, is that I feel like because we're so engaged with being on Zoom and being on Skype and whatever video conferencing we use, that I feel like I'm walking around with a mirror in front of my face all the time. Like I'm constantly being forced to look at myself. And I think a lot of people, myself included, sometimes think about personal style as being kind of superficial and we shouldn't worry about it so much. But you actually talk about it in the book as being a public service. And so I was hoping you might talk about that a little bit.
Well, I think it's a lot of things. Number one, it's an antidepressant. You know, making an effort with your appearance, a little vanity is very life affirming. You know, you see somebody who's depressed, you can see them coming down the street towards you. They look, you know, unkempt or, you know, uncared for, not soigné. And so I think there's, if you make an effort with your appearance, it's very life affirming. It's life affirming for other people. So everyone loves to see, you got an office, somebody in your office or in your work milieu who always makes an extra effort and throws together crazy outfits. Even if you don't particularly like what they're wearing, you applaud that kind of panache in other people. But it's important to look like yourself, like your decor. It's very restrained, but it's very you. You know, like it's very chic, it's very simple. It's not like, you know, some Baroque crazy apartment with Versace wallpaper. That would be the antithesis. You're probably going to scream if I at that idea.
It's so funny that you mentioned that, because one of my questions is, of course, I thought a lot about my backdrop before we hopped on this call, particularly because in the book, you basically say that a lack of decor qualifies as a crime against humanity. And so I was thinking about that when I was kind of like picking up a little bit, and I was like, oh, I don't have anything on the walls. And yeah, I mean, so you think that as long as the decor reflects you, it's kind of okay.
Yeah, like if I, you know, lived in your room, my friends would say, wow, you're very austere at home, aren't you? Like you're all, you know, the English say all fur coat and no panties, you know, you're all done up when you go out, and then at home you're very austere. But with you, I see your decor is completely assonant with your personal style and who you are.
That's great to know. So you talk a lot about individual style, personal style, both in terms of decor, but also in terms of people, cultural figures who you consider heroes of style. And I think the list of people that you have in the book is a really interesting list. Can you talk a little bit about, give us some examples of some of the people that you chose and why you chose them and why you think their style is so great.
Well, I remember my Phaidon meetings with you and Sarah, and we would spend quite a lot of time batting around names of people that we thought really looked like themselves. And you really have to sort of, initially when I engaged with this book, I engaged with it in a more superficial way, and you guys pushed me and we dug deeper. And so the list we end up with of people that really look like themselves. Think about it. And I think it was you or maybe Sarah who suggested Robert Mueller. Here is somebody who really looks like themselves. That's how broad we went, because we wanted to get out of the cliche fashion idea of it can only be some model or something like that. And so we went broad. We have everyone from Simone de Beauvoir to, Grace Coddington, right the way through to Karl Lagerfeld, but definitely quirky people. Louise Bourgeois, the artist, I always thought, there's somebody who looks like themselves. Their appearance is a perfect mirror of who they are, their intrinsic personality.
It's so funny because I wish I could take credit for Robert Mueller, but that was definitely Sarah's idea. My contribution was Conor McGregor.
Oh, yeah. Well, I think you and I were both on the Conor McGregor tip because he's a great example of male flamboyance, which is it's a little rare. Not a lot of men will go there, especially heterosexual men. It's unusual. And he and Floyd Mayweather, sports figures, often will go there and get dressed up. It's really fun. I mean, they're feeding the economy. We should be grateful.
Absolutely. He's a total dandy. That's what I think. He just totally lives it as big as he can. So speaking of the economy, people obviously are money conscious right now and are spending a lot of money or feel like they shouldn't, but they're also spending a lot of time in their homes. And one of the things that I think is really great about the book is that you talk a lot about bringing a kind of DIY mentality to both your personal style as well as your home style. And and you talk about how you can create things instead of just buying them. So for you, and obviously also for your husband, Jonathan Adler, making things with your hands is so important. Why do you think making things with your hands is such an important path to self-expression and to being yourself?
Well, I had over 30 years of being in the window display world, and my days were like making giant poodles out of feather dusters, and there's nothing I haven't created with my hands, and it's immensely satisfying and fun. And I started writing in my late 40s, so most of my life was spent actually with the chicken wire and the paper mache and making wigs and blah, blah, blah. And I always really enjoyed it, and I found it very therapeutic. And then I noticed in recent years, society has gotten very complicated. There's a lot more stress that I think people experience. How many people do you know who've taken up pottery in the last few years? Like, I know so many people. I'm trying to think of somebody I know who hasn't taken up pottery, because I think it's very primal. People have discovered that making things, sewing things, there's a reason why, your great aunties would sit around knitting furiously around the fire. It was extraordinarily therapeutic, and you had something to show for it at the end. So
yeah, I took up knitting myself, which I had never done before, and I created an 8-foot long skirt. It's like gigantic. I don't know whether I actually read the instructions wrong. It's kind of hideous. It's sort of gap-toothed and weird looking, but it was like one of the best things I did all summer.
Oh, how fun. I'm dying to see it. You don't have it handy, I do.
I actually do. I'll show it to you later. So Yeah, so one of the things, it's funny because you talk about the fact that you always aim toward the totally superficial, and that Sarah and I were kind of always trying to, bat you down to reality and sort of keep you on the straight and narrow. But one of the things that I think is so great about the book and in the book is that a lot of it is obviously focused on the self and being true to yourself and living your own life. But at the end of the book, you talk about this concept of unselfing, which is, I think, like one of the greatest expressions. I had never heard it before. So I was hoping you would talk a little bit about what that means and where the expression came from.
Well, a few years ago, Jonathan and I have a house out in Shelter Island. And a few years ago, the library had a big sale. And I went to the library sale, and they had all these great first editions, 50s, 60s, and they had beautiful covers. So I'm mesmerized by these covers. And there was an astonishing number of Iris Murdoch books. And when Iris Murdoch was writing, I didn't read them. I tried reading A Severed Head, and, it was a bit too existential and grown up. I think you had to be an adult to understand them, and I was too infantile. So as a youth, I didn't really get Iris Murdoch. I was too dumb, basically. So then I dived in and started reading. I bought a whole bunch of them, and they were beautiful covers. I bought them for the covers. And then I kind of got into it, and I thought, where did she get off on writing these crazy books? I won't just get into too much detail, but then I read about her, and she was a philosophy professor, and she's the first person to kind of unearth existentialism and write about it. She wrote a book about it before really people knew what it was. And a lot of her books are based around the idea of existentialism. And she's actually, I cite her as somebody who looks like themselves too, because she looked like this very serious blue stocking with a bowl haircut. And she really looked like herself. Anyway, in reading about her, she was very anti the idea that a book you should be writing about yourself. A lot of people say books are, the author's really writing about themselves, which I'm definitely that person. She always tried not to do that. She said, she had a lot of contempt for authors who got bathed in their own identity as if it was bath water or something like that. But she was very into this concept of unselfing, and she came upon it. One day she was looking out the window and she was feeling miffed, so that she'd had some dent in her prestige. Somebody had said something about her, or she hadn't gotten a job she should have got. She was having one of those horrible moments that we have where you're just in a sniggle piggle about, you're in a little fury about some slight. You've been slighted. And then she looked out the window and saw this bird of prey soaring in the sky, and it took her out of herself and her, silly preoccupation. And she, I think that's when she came up with the idea of unselfing. And I thought it's a good one for today, because we all spend time not just looking at ourselves on Zoom, but the obsession with the self on social media and blah, blah, blah. So it is kind of good to get out of your head and look around. So unselfing, I like it.
Yeah, I like that idea too. So speaking of unselfing, I'm going to stop asking you questions, and I'm going to take a few questions that have been submitted by attendees in the audience. I'm just going to read them straight as they are. So from Patrick in Seattle, Simon, a big hello from Seattle. Missing my trips to New York and the inspiration they always bring. Our downtown has lost 100+ stores. And restaurants, and most remaining are boarded up. How can downtown retail revitalize itself? A sad time for window dressers. Give Mark V a big hug, elbow bump, or maybe a shrug for me.
Hi, Patrick. I know Patrick and I were colleagues for many years. He's fantastic. And so a huge hello. And one of these, I'm not very good at that, heart. I think retail's very protean. There are areas of New York that collapsed in the early 20th century. There were big stores, and then they came back. in the 90s. So retail is a very protean force that will find a new shape, find a new way of being, and sending you tons of love. And it's sad. Retail means a lot to people, even if they're not in retail. Just the existence of shops, the stores, is something very basic about that in people's sense of order and well-being, that, walking into the marketplace, as it were, is something people have been doing since ancient times. And so take that away and they suffer. So, but I'm an optimist. It's protein.
Yeah. So the next question from Matt in London. Hello, Simon. Can I begin by complimenting you on that amazing sweater, which of course was one of the inspirations for the cover of the jacket. I'm saying that as an aside. You've embraced the stripe so successfully. I'd like to ask you if you could describe a typical memorable Simon Doonan day pre-pandemic.
A typical day pre-pandemic, I guess I still love to do a whole different bunch of things. I mean, a typical day would be writing in the morning when my brain's working properly. And then I go have lunch down at my husband's studio and see all the new things that he's making. He's very prolific. So there's always new stuff, new furniture, new ceramics, look at things with him, new stuff. And then take a leisurely walk home because, I had over 30 years of having a sort of fairly demanding corporate job. So not rushing. It's like my big treat now. And staggering home, maybe even having a nap, and reading a bit, and then doing a bit more writing, just trying to be less demented. Because I always had a lot of drive and I always, nothing was happening quick enough. I was very impatient. I was very used to the flow of retail where it's, everything is like chop, chop, let's get on with it. So now enjoying being a bit more lollygagging, like, laying around and eating lotuses and wearing dove gray spats kind of period of my life.
You're the only person who can just naturally use the word lollygagging in a sentence and it just totally flows. That actually brings me to a question from Rebecca in the US. Where did you get your amazing vocabulary? She said, I've learned so many amazing words from you during this. And actually, we have a glossary of terms in the back of the book. Can you speak a little bit about how you cobbled together this amazing vocabulary?
Well, yes. It's down to one particular thing. In England, when I was a kid, everyone listened to the radio. You got up, you turned on the radio. And BBC, anyone who listens to BBC Radio 4, they just, especially back then, you turn on Radio 4 and they'd have a Samuel Beckett play. Or they'd have like a John Cage concert. It was quite weirdly highbrow. And my parents didn't go to college. We weren't like a posh academic family, but that radio was on. And everyone of that generation, I think, has an extensive vocabulary. And it's all because of the BBC. Book at bedtime, and they didn't think, we have to, they gave the people what the people ought to have. It wasn't done by marketing or anything. So I'm the beneficiary of that, hearing, everyone from Dylan Thomas through to, I don't know, you name them. They were on the BBC. And it's still pretty good, Radio 4.
Yeah. Yeah, and you definitely have some New York culture injected in there as well, which sort of shows your more recent American roots.
I'm also a bit of a Valley girl too, because I lived in LA for 8 years in the 70s and 80s, and so I've got a bit of Val going on as well. Totally.
Exactly. Let's see, other questions. So let's see, Amy has a question in New York. So putting on your retail guru hat, do you have any life-changing advice for shop owners and buyers and floor staff who, as you say in the book about your 30 years at Barney's, have a great gig and aren't walking away, especially now when many of them have had to pivot to create what are essentially digital shop windows? Interesting.
Yeah, I mean, it's brutal what's happened to retail, and I always used to tell people, if in doubt, get a job in retail, and then just coast and figure
Yeah.
out what you want to do, because you're out, you're dressed up, you're with people. When Auntie Mame loses everything, she goes get a job selling roller skates at Macy's. So retail was the great sort of catch-all,
Yeah.
and now that I can't recommend that to young kids, because I would say, okay, you got a lot of figuring out to do, but in the meantime, this is what
Right.
I did. I got a job at John Lewis, and it was great. You got fun colleagues, and everyone's in a good mood, and there's people around all the time.
Yeah.
So it's tragic that sort of the pause button is there. But, there's other ways to slice it. There's also now, in this day and age, incredible sites like Etsy, where you can, like if you got into knitting more scarves, let's say you knitted 50 of these scarves that are 8 foot long, you could actually open your own Etsy shop and specialize in 8 foot long scarves. Etsy, something like Etsy and the World Wide Web provides people with a platform. So I think it's about just trying to try some of the new things that are available that weren't available before.
Yeah, it's like a transformed retail space. Everybody can have their own retail space, and everybody can be their own window dresser in terms of having your sort of online space where you can just kind of do your thing. It's kind of great. Let's see. From Tico in Amsterdam, do you think there are many people who cannot or don't want to be themselves? If so, what effect do you think that will have?
I think, it's a struggle. Everyone, to be yourself, to feel fulfilled, to look like yourself, and to have a sense of self, it's a lifetime project for everybody.
Yeah.
I think I got a head start because my parents were, as I say, not overly concerned with the opinions of others. My mom was an outsider. She was from Belfast, but living in England. So back then, Irish people were considered more marginal. And, so that idea of looking outside for validation is sort of a contemporary phenomenon. The extent of it today is incredible. People are always looking, they use their phone as a mirror. What's the internet saying about me? What's social media saying about me? But I think it's always been challenging, but now with social media creating this sort of turning us all into raving narcissists if we're not careful, it's probably more complex now and requires more. I think that, what in my book, I just tried to make it sort of give people a sense of reckless fun. Why not? Why not? You walk by that wig shop and there's that blue wig in the window that you've always thought, that's kind of fabulous, that blue wig, sort of this color.
Yeah.
Just buy it. It's $10 and cut it into a sort of, Jane Birkin kind of style. Just have fun, wear it.
Yeah. It's funny, there was a question from Melanie, who's a designer in London, and I think it feeds into your sort of, talking about, people becoming too narcissistic or obsessed with social media. Do you think that social media is counterproductive to finding yourself? Or do you think it's a way you can explore yourself? I guess it could kind of go both ways.
Well, through social media, you can find like-minded spirits. You can find people who are also reckless and fun and contrarian. There's nothing more fun than following someone on Instagram who's just kind of a bit nuts. You don't want to follow conventional, predictable people. So I think everyone kind of digs that because it's like, oh, right. What are we worried, concerned about how we look? And, it's nice to be liberated from that. But it's not easy. I think I know a lot of people who struggle with it. And, it can make people miserable worrying about what everybody else thinks. It's a trap.
Yeah, and forced conformity as well, feeling like you have to be like everyone else. So I guess I have time for one last question, which is from Billy in New York. What is your next book about?
Well, during lockdown, I've been toying with, as I say, I lived in LA from the sort of late 70s into the mid 80s. And it was a really wacky period. LA was sort of a forgotten place back then. People kind of ashamed of it. It was before the new obsession with celebrity got going again. So it was actually a kind of bleak, dusty place with tumbleweeds blowing down Santa Monica Boulevard, but in a totally great way. It was a great place to live when you're self-inventing, finding out who you are, self-dramatizing. I am forever grateful I got the opportunity to go live there and have at least, lion's share of my 20s in LA in that place, which was so inexpensive to live and felt kind of bleak, but was reinventing itself in a very interesting way. So I've been cobbling together recollections of that period and seeing if it's if there's anything there. That's the torture of books. You have to basically write them before you find out they're horrible and don't mean anything. Or
but that's how
conversely, that you get a bullseye.
Exactly. All right. Well, thank you so much, Simon, for talking with us today. I'm going to close out the conversation with a quote that you say actually in your introduction, which I think is the perfect sign off. And after I say the quote, I'm going to go and get my scarf so everyone can see it. The quote is, "The only surefire way to achieve self-knowledge is to stop wanking around with your life as it were a series of upcoming, as yet unscheduled Instagram posts, and to simply explore yourself this instant." So that, I think, is fantastic advice. We should all heed. And Simon, I'm going to let you say a last thought while I go get my scarf.
Stripes. Yes.
Can you see?
Like I say, I'm not the only author that had a sweater that looked like their book, Dostoevsky. They all did it, So that's where I got the idea. So stripes. That scarf. Oh my God.
Here's what.
This should be in the Guinness Book of Records.
I know.
Does Mabel ever attack it?
All the time. All the time. Okay, well, thanks everyone so much for joining.
Hello, booksellers and everybody. Thank you for listening. Thank you for everything.